The wind on the moon of Okaris did not just blow, it scoured. It was a physical weight, a heavy, abrasive blanket of red dust and oxidized iron that sought to strip the flesh from bone and the paint from steel. Inside the reinforced walls of the homestead, the screaming of the gale was reduced to a dull, vibrating thrum, a constant reminder that outside these 3 rooms, the universe was hostile and indifferent. Rhys Calder sat at his kitchen table, a slab of synthetic polymer that had seen better decades. He stared into a cup of coffee that was technically black sludge reconstituted from a powder, but it was hot, and it contained caffeine, which were the only 2 qualities that mattered. His right hand, the one made of flesh and bone, tapped a rhythmic beat against the mug. His left hand, a heavy industrial-grade cybernetic prosthetic stripped of its synthetic skin to reveal the matte black carbon fiber and hydraulic pistons underneath, lay motionless on the table. It was a relic of the war, just like the man attached to it. The lighting in the cabin was low, amber-hued to save power during the storm cycle. In the corner, a holographic newsfeed flickered against the textured wall, the volume set to a murmur. The anchor, a polished man with teeth that looked too white to be real, was talking about the Valyri Empire. Rhys knew the Valyri. He knew the way their ships looked like teardrops made of silver glass. He knew the sound their disruptor rifles made, a high-pitched whine that you felt in your molars before it boiled your blood. He knew they were tall, beautiful, and terrifyingly psychic. And he knew that the fragile truce holding the border worlds together was fraying like an old rope. The newsfeed shifted to a graphic of the border zones. Unexplained incidents, the anchor said. Frigates going silent, cargo haulers drift with their crews missing. And then, the political angle. There were rumors of a Valyri princess, a radical who was breaking from the Imperial High Council to advocate for a total demilitarization of the frontier. The pundits called her an extremist. Rhys called her naive. Peace was just the intermission between wars. He had learned that lesson 20 years ago on a mudball planet called Ethelgard, and the shrapnel still lodged near his spine was the receipt for the education. He took a sip of the bitter coffee and grimaced. He was 45 years old, but his joints felt 60. He had come to Okaris to be alone, to farm moisture from the atmosphere and sell it to the orbital refineries, and to go entire weeks without hearing a human voice. The universe, however, had a wicked sense of humor. A sound ripped through the thrum of the storm, a noise so loud it bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his chest cavity. It was the scream of the atmosphere being torn apart by something massive and dying. Rhys dropped his mug. It shattered, splashing dark liquid across the floor, but he was already moving. He reached the reinforced window just as the fireball turned the cobalt evening sky into a blinding sheet of white and orange. A starship, or what was left of one, was screaming overhead, trailing a plume of black smoke and ionized plasma. It was losing altitude fast, fighting gravity and losing the war. He watched, knuckles white on the sill, as the main fuselage disintegrated in a shower of sparks. But a smaller section, an escape pod, tight and spherical, punched through the debris field. It slammed into the canyon floor 3 miles east of his homestead. The ground jumped. The shockwave hit the cabin 2 seconds later, rattling the mugs on the shelf and flickering the power grid. Then, silence returned, save for the howling wind. Rhys stood there for a long moment. His instincts, honed by 2 decades of combat and Black Ops missions, were screaming at him. Gear up. Secure the perimeter. Investigate. Neutralize. His conscious mind fought back. He was retired. He was a moisture farmer. He was done with burning ships and dying soldiers. He should sit back down, clean up the coffee, and call the colonial marshals. They would arrive in 3 days, weather permitting. Whoever was in that pod would be dead by then. He looked at his cybernetic hand. He flexed the fingers, the servos whirring softly in the quiet room. "Damn it," he whispered. He moved to the weapons locker by the airlock. He did not want to do this. He swore he wanted no more missions. But the buried need to be useful, the soldier's compulsion to run toward the fire when everyone else ran away, was a ghost he had never successfully exorcised. He pulled on his armor cloak, a heavy weave of ballistic fabric and environmental shielding that smelled of ozone and old sweat. He strapped his atmospheric goggles over his eyes and checked the seal on his respirator. Finally, he took the kinetic rifle from the rack. It was heavy, scarred, and illegal for a civilian to own. He checked the charge pack, full. Reese cycled the airlock and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, shoving him sideways. He leaned into it, engaging the magnetic clamps in his boots to keep his footing on the slick, iron-rich rock. Visibility was less than 10 feet. The red dust swirled in violent eddies, cutting visibility to a bloody haze. He navigated by memory and by the heads-up display projected onto the interior of his goggles. The crash site was a heat signature blooming red against the cold blue of the canyon map. He trudged forward, his mechanical arm shielding his face from the worst of the grit. The storm was intensifying, whipping up razor-sharp shards of shale that pinged off his armor like hail. As he got closer, the environment changed. The smell of ozone overpowered the dust. Arcs of electrical discharge jumped between the rocks, residue from the ship's ruptured engines. The ground was scorched black. The sand turned to glass in jagged streaks. He crested the ridge and looked down. The escape pod was half buried in a dune of red sand and shattered rock. It was not human manufacture. It was smooth, ovoid, and made of a material that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Vellery tech, imperial grade. The hull was etched with glowing glyphs that pulsed with a fading violet rhythm. Reese slid down the embankment, his rifle raised, stock pressed tight against his shoulder. He scanned the perimeter. No movement, no secondary pods, just this one lonely seed dropped from a dying flower. He reached the pod. The heat radiating from it was intense enough to warp the air. He found the manual release mechanism, a recessed panel that hummed when his hand neared it. Valyri technology was bio-tuned, usually responding only to the specific genetic markers of the owner, but escape pods were designed for emergency access. He jammed his cybernetic fingers into the override slots. The metal of his hand groaned as he applied hydraulic pressure, forcing the locking clamps to shear. With a hiss of equalizing pressure, the hatch blew outward, tumbling into the sand. Steam billowed out, smelling of sterilized air and copper. Reese leveled his rifle at the opening. Freezing, he barked, his voice amplified by his helmet speaker. A figure stirred within the smoke. It pulled itself up from the crash webbing with a groan of pain that sounded almost melodic. The being that emerged was a vision of impossible contrast against the harsh, dirty reality of the frontier moon. She was tall, even by human standards, with limbs that were long and wiry. Her skin was luminous, holding a faint inner pearlescence that seemed to defy the gloom of the storm. Intricate bioluminescent markings, like constellations of violet starlight, traced the line of her throat and disappeared beneath the collar of her torn armor. Her hair was white, stark and bright, though now it was matted with blood that looked almost black in the dim light. She wore the armor of the Imperial House, white ceramic plates over a bodysuit of shifting, liquid mesh, but the ceramic was cracked, and the mesh was torn at her side. She stumbled out of the pod, one hand clutching her ribs, the other raising a weapon. It was a sleek, curved pistol that looked more like a piece of art than a tool for killing. She pointed it directly at Reese's chest. Reese did not flinch. He had a kinetic rifle aimed at her head. They stood there in the howling wind, 5 feet apart, 2 ghosts from different worlds locked in a stalemate. "Drop the weapon," Reese said, his voice flat. The alien woman narrowed her eyes. They were large, lacking a white sclera, filled instead with a shifting field of indigo and silver flecks, like deep space caught in a bottle. "Put down your crude slug thrower, primitive soldier," she hissed. Her voice was strained, breathless, but the imperial accent, haughty, clipped, and melodic, was unmistakable. Reese snorted behind his mask. "Over-decorated glow stick. You are bleeding out. Drop the gun before you pass out and shoot your own foot." "How dare you?" she gasped, swaying slightly. "I am—" She took a step forward, trying to steady her aim, but her legs folded, her eyes rolled back, the star fields within them dimming as consciousness fled. The pistol slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the rocks. She collapsed forward. Reese moved before he thought about it. He slung his rifle and caught her before she hit the ground. She was surprisingly heavy. Valerie bone density was higher than human, built for high-gravity core worlds. Her skin was fever-hot to the touch, even through his gloves. He looked down at her. The blood was soaking through her white armor, a dark, spreading stain. She was an enemy combatant. She was a Valyria elite. By all rights, he should leave her here for the marshals or for the desert. He looked at the horizon. The storm was getting worse. The razor winds would strip the flesh from her bones in an hour if he left her exposed. "Damn it," he said again, with more feeling this time. He adjusted his grip, hoisting her into a fireman's carry. "Stabilization for later transfer," he muttered to himself, a lie to soothe the soldier in his brain who was shouting that this was a mistake. Prisoner transport. That is all this is. He began the long trek back to the cabin. The return trip was brutal. The wind fought him every step of the way, and the extra weight made his boots sink deep into the shifting sand. His cybernetic shoulder whined in protest, the servos heating up as they compensated for the load. The woman on his back was unconscious, her breathing shallow and ragged against his ear. By the time he cycled the airlock and stumbled into the relative silence of his living quarters, Reese was drenched in sweat. He lowered her onto the long table in the center of the room, sweeping the debris of his broken coffee mug onto the floor with his boot. He sealed the heavy blast shutters over the windows, plunging the room into the artificial twilight of the emergency lights. He stripped off his armor cloak and goggles, tossing them into the corner. He approached the table. She looked different in the cabin light, less like a monster, more like a broken doll. The bioluminescence on her neck was pulsing faintly, a slow, rhythmic fading that synchronized with her heartbeat. Reese retrieved his medkit. It was a surplus field trauma case, illegal and highly effective. He cut away the ruined sections of her bodysuit with a laser scalpel. The wound was ugly. A jagged piece of shrapnel, likely from the pod's hull, had punched through the armor and lodged in her side, just above the hip. He washed his hands, scrubbing them with antiseptic until the skin was raw. He looked at his hands, one pink and scarred, the other black carbon and steel. He took a breath to steady them. He had patched up soldiers in the mud of Ethelgard under mortar fire. He could do this. He worked quickly. He removed the shrapnel with forceps, the metal clinking into a metal tray. She flinched in her sleep, a small sound of distress escaping her lips. "Easy," he murmured, his voice dropping to a soothing register he hadn't used in years. "I've got you." He applied a generous dollop of human med gel to the wound. It foamed on contact, cauterizing the blood vessels and numbing the nerves. Then he applied a scavenged patch of alien nanofiber he had bought off a smuggler months ago, hoping it would be compatible with her biology. The fiber mesh knit itself into her skin, glowing faintly as it began to repair the tissue. He stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. He watched her chest rise and fall. She was beautiful. It was an objective fact, like the hardness of diamond or the heat of a star. Her facial structure was angular, elegant, seemingly carved from marble. Her lashes were long and white against her luminous skin. Rhys realized he was staring. He scowled and turned away to clean his instruments. "You are getting soft." Calder, he thought. She is a Valerie. She probably looks at you and sees a hairless ape with a calculator glued to his arm. A gasp from the table made him spin around. She was awake. She was sitting up, clutching her side, her eyes wide and panicked. The star flecks in her irises were swirling violently. "Where is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling, her gaze locked onto him. And then Rhys felt it. It was like a cold finger pressing into the center of his brain. The psychic touch. Valerie were natural telepaths, though their strength varied. She was pushing into his mind, not with finesse, but with the brute force of panic. For a second, the walls of the cabin dissolved. Rhys was back in the mud. The sky was burning. The smell of charred meat. A child's doll lying in a puddle. The order coming through the comms. Burn it all. The weight of the detonator in his hand. The scream of the dying city. No! The woman recoiled as if he had struck her physically. She scrambled back to the edge of the table, knocking over the tray of instruments. She breathed hard, her eyes wide with horror. "You," she whispered. I saw the fire, the screaming." Rhys shook his head, the phantom smell of smoke still in his nostrils. He slammed his mental shields down, a technique he had spent years perfecting to keep the nightmares in check. "Stay out of my head," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. She looked at him, really looked at him, and her expression shifted. The horror remained, but beneath it, there was something else. Confusion. Curiosity. "You are drowning in it," she said softly. "The guilt, it is a black ocean." Rhys took a step toward her. "Stop. Do not do that." She blinked, the glow on her throat flaring brighter for a moment. She looked down at her side, seeing the bandage, the med gel. She looked at the warm blanket he had draped over her legs. She looked back at his face, seeing the lines of exhaustion, the scars, the human eyes that were hard but not cruel. "You saved me," she said, sounding surprised. "I stabilized a hostile," Rhys corrected, leaning back against the counter and crossing his arms. "Do not read into it." She straightened her spine, wincing slightly but regaining some of that imperious composure. "I am Lyris Valerian, daughter of the Third House, keeper of the Silver Spire, and I demand to know who has taken me prisoner." Rhys looked her over. Princess Lyris, the extremist, the one the news feeds were screaming about. Of course, he couldn't have rescued a cargo pilot or a lost tourist. He had to rescue the most politically volatile woman in the sector. "I am just Rhys," he said. "Just Rhys?" She raised a white eyebrow. "You have the hands of a surgeon and the mind of a killer. You are not just anything." "I am the guy who pulled you out of a burning crater," Rhys said. "Which means you are currently standing in my living room. And since I haven't decided whether to turn you over to the marshals or throw you back out into the storm, I would suggest you drop the royal attitude." Lyris opened her mouth to retort, likely something sharp and devastating, but a harsh electronic warble cut her off. Reese spun toward his console. The proximity alarm. He tapped the keyboard with his flesh hand, bringing up the external sensor grid. The screen washed red. "What is it?" Lyris asked, the haughtiness vanishing. Reese watched the data scrolling across the screen. Orbital scans, high frequency. They are mapping the topography, looking for thermal anomalies. He keyed in a command, bringing up a grainy image from one of his perimeter cameras. In the distance, hovering above the crash site he had just left, were 3 sleek, black drones. They looked like predatory insects, scanning the wreckage with laser grids. "Hunter-seekers," Reese said grimly. "Military grade, but not colonial. Those are Valyri designs." Lyris went pale, her luminosity dimming until she looked almost gray. "They found me. They are trying to finish the job." Reese looked at her. "Who is?" "My own people," she said, her voice hollow. "Or a faction of them. They shot down my shuttle. They want me silenced." Reese looked back at the screen. The drones were widening their search pattern. They were moving toward the homestead. "If they scan this shack, they will pick up your biosignature," Reese said. "Valyri physiology runs hot. You will light up like a flare." He made a decision. He hated it, but he made it. He slammed his hand onto a large red lever on the console. Heavy maglocks engaged on the door and the blast shutters. A low hum filled the room as the jamming field generator kicked to life in the basement. "What are you doing?" Lyris asked. "Going dark," Reese said. "I am masking our heat signature and scattering the sensor waves. It will look like just another magnetic anomaly on the surface. This moon is full of them." He turned to face her. The jamming field cuts comms too. No signals in, no signals out. Lyris looked around the small, dim room, the realization dawning on her. "How long?" she asked. Reese checked the sensor telemetry. The drones were thorough. They would be sweeping this grid for a while. And if they had ground teams coming? 2 days, Reese said. Maybe 3. Until the storm covers our tracks and they move the search grid to the next sector. He walked over to the kitchen unit and pulled a ration bar from a container, tossing it to her. She caught it with surprising reflexes. "Get comfortable, Your Highness," Reese said, sitting heavily in his chair and picking up his rifle to clean it. "We are stuck together." Lyris looked at the sealed door, then at the scarred, dangerous human cleaning his weapon. She looked at the ration bar in her hand, which looked like a brick of compressed sawdust. She let out a breath that was half sigh, half sob. "Wonderful," she said. Outside, the wind howled, burying the homestead in dust and secrets. The storm outside did not relent. For 2 days, the red dust of Okaris hammered against the reinforced hull of the homestead, a ceaseless grinding percussion that turned the 3-room cabin into a pressurized vessel buried at the bottom of a sand ocean. The isolation was absolute. The silence of the jamming field Reese had activated sat heavy in the air, a blanket of static that cut them off from the galaxy. Inside, the atmosphere was tighter than the seal on the airlock. Reese Calder was a man who had spent the last 5 years cultivating silence. He liked the quiet. He liked that his coffee cup was always exactly where he left it. He liked that the only voice he heard was the wind. Now, his sanctuary was invaded by a 6-foot-tall alien aristocrat who seemed to take up all the available oxygen in the room. They circled each other like 2 predators trapped in a cage, an uneasy truce held together by necessity and the howling wind outside. Reese watched from the kitchen island as Lyris attempted to navigate the domestic reality of a frontier bachelor. She stood before the coffee maker, a battered machine that hissed and spat steam like a dying engine. She held a mug of the resulting black liquid with 2 fingers, examining it with the same suspicion one might reserve for a biological weapon. "This is a beverage?" Lyris asked, her voice echoing slightly in the small space. She sniffed it and wrinkled her nose, the bioluminescent markings on her throat shifting from a calm blue to a skeptical violet. "It smells like burnt chemical waste." "It is coffee," Rhys grunted, not looking up from the weapon he was cleaning. "Or at least, the canister says it is coffee. It has caffeine. It keeps you awake. Drink it or do not." Lyris took a tentative sip. She shuddered, a full-body reaction that made her white hair shimmy. "Barbarians," she whispered, setting the mug down with a decisive clatter. "On Valyria, morning stimulants are infused with nectar and served in heated crystal. This tastes like despair, it tastes like survival," Rhys corrected. "And you are welcome." He watched her move to the fresher unit, the small utilitarian shower stall in the corner. She stopped at the door, staring at the rusted manual handle. She waved her hand in front of it. Nothing happened. She waved again, more vigorously. Still nothing. She looked back at Rhys, her expression a mix of confusion and royal indignation. "The interface is broken," she stated. "The door refuses to recognize my gestural command." "It is a handle," Rhys said, fighting the urge to roll his eyes. "You grab it, you turn it, you pull. No AI, no gestures, just friction and leverage." Lyris looked at her hand, then at the rusted metal, as if he had asked her to plunge her arm into a reactor core. She reached out, gingerly gripped the metal and turned. The door creaked open. She looked back at him, eyes wide. "Primitive," she muttered, stepping inside. "Absolutely archaic." Rhys snorted and went back to his rifle. He was stripping the bolt carrier group, oiling the firing pin with methodical precision. While he mocked her, he was also watching her. He had noticed the way her eyes scanned the room when she thought he wasn't looking. She was memorizing the layout, she was checking the exits, she was counting the steps between the bed and the weapon rack. He didn't trust her. Not yet. When she emerged from the fresher scrubbed clean and wearing one of his oversized gray thermal shirts that hung to her knees, Rhys quickly slid a heavy vibro knife under a stack of data pads on the table. He didn't think she was an assassin. Her shock at the crash had been too genuine. But she was Valyri. They were known for 2 things, their psychic abilities and their political treachery. Lyris saw the movement. Her eyes narrowed, the star flecks within them sharpening. "You do not need to hide the knives." "Rhys," she said, her voice cool, "if I wanted to kill you, I would have done it while you were sleeping. I could liquefy your frontal lobe with a thought if I concentrated hard enough." Rhys looked at her. "You passed out from a scratch on your side yesterday." "I think my frontal lobe is safe for now." Lyris bristled, her pride stinging. It was not a scratch. It was a kinetic impact trauma, and my neural output is currently limited by physical exhaustion. But do not test me. Human. "I am just cleaning up," Rhys lied smoothly. The tension between them was a physical thing, a taut wire vibrating in the center of the room. But later that afternoon, the universe decided to test that wire. A massive boom of thunder shook the foundation of the homestead. The lights in the cabin surged, flaring blindingly white before dying completely. The hum of the atmospheric recyclers cut out. The silence that followed was heavy and sudden. Rhys was on his feet instantly. "Generator," he barked. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the maintenance hatch on the floor. Lyris followed him, not waiting for an invitation. They dropped down into the crawl space that housed the fusion battery and the environmental controls. The air down here was thick with the smell of ozone and burning insulation. Reese shone the light on the main breaker panel. It was a mess of sparks and smoke. The surge fried the coupling. Reese shouted over the sound of the wind pounding the structure above. If we do not reset the magnetic containment field in 5 minutes, the battery dumps its charge and we lose life support. He jammed a pry bar into the panel, trying to force the casing open, and it was stuck. He swore, putting his cybernetic arm into it, the servos whining as he applied 500 pounds of torque. The metal shrieked and gave way. Inside, the circuitry was a blackened ruin. "It is bypassed," Reese yelled. "The regulator chip is toast. I have to rewire it manually." He started grabbing wires, stripping them with his teeth, his hands moving in a blur. But the schematic was complex and the smoke was making his eyes water. "Move," Lyris said. She didn't shout, but her voice cut through the noise. She pushed past him, her shoulder brushing against his chest. She didn't look at the wires with human eyes. She looked at the energy flow. "The red conduit is the primary feed," she said, pointing a long, slender finger at a tangle of cables. "The blue is the ground. Your system is trying to route power through a blown capacitor. You need to bridge the intake directly to the output." "That will overload the grid," Reese argued. "No," Lyris snapped. "Not if you phase the current. Look at the frequency." She reached in. She didn't have tools, and she clearly didn't know how to use his wire cutters, but she had something else. She placed her fingertips on the copper leads. A faint violet light pulsed from her skin, conducting the electricity, sensing the resistance. "Connect the red to the yellow," she ordered. "Do it now." Reese hesitated for a fraction of a second, then obeyed. He twisted the wires together. Sparks showered over them. "Now the bypass," Lyris commanded. Reese slammed the manual breaker down. The generator groaned, a deep, ascending whine. Then, with a solid clunk, the magnetic field stabilized. The lights in the crawl space flickered back on. The hum of the air recyclers returned. Reese slumped back against the bulkhead, wiping grease and sweat from his forehead. He looked at Lyris. She was staring at the panel, her hands trembling slightly, soot smudged across her luminous cheekbone. "Phasing the current," Reese muttered. "That was clever." Lyris looked at him, a small, tired smile touching her lips. It was basic energy dynamics. "Reese, your machinery is crude, but the physics remains constant." "You saved our air," Reese admitted grudgingly. "And you provided the brute force to open the panel," she replied. They sat there for a moment in the dirt and the grease, the class divide between princess and grunt temporarily bridged by the universal language of keeping one's lungs full of air. Reese looked at her hands, delicate, glowing faintly, and realized that under the royal attitude there was a steel spine. "Let us get out of this hole," Reese said, offering her a hand up. She took it. Her skin was cool and smooth, and for a second he felt a faint buzz against his palm, like touching a low-voltage battery. He pulled her up, and she didn't let go immediately. "Thank you," she said softly. Reese pulled his hand back, clearing his throat. "Do not mention it." The truce held through dinner, which consisted of rehydrated protein stew that Lyris ate without complaint, though she did look mournfully at the empty spice rack. But the storm had one more insult to throw at them. Around midnight, a localized lightning strike hit the external heat exchange unit. The internal temperature of the cabin began to drop. Reese woke up seeing his breath misting in the air. The ambient temperature gauge on the wall read 5 degrees Celsius and falling. The backup heating coils were struggling, but without the main exchanger, the homestead was bleeding heat into the freezing lunar night. He cursed and sat up. He was wearing thermal fatigues, but the cold was biting. He looked across the room. Lyris was curled into a tight ball on the small cot he had set up for her, shivering violently. Valerie came from a tropical world. Their metabolism ran hotter than humans, but they had zero tolerance for cold. If her core temperature dropped too low, she would go into metabolic shock. Rhys stood up and grabbed the emergency blankets, thick, foil-lined sheets designed to reflect body heat. He walked over to her. "Lyris," he said, "wake up." She uncurled slowly, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Her skin had lost its luminosity, turning a dull, ashy gray. Her eyes were unfocused. "See cold," she stammered. "It is so cold." "The heater is down," Rhys said. "We have to conserve heat." He threw the blankets over her, but she was shaking too hard. The blankets wouldn't generate heat. They would only trap what was there, and she didn't have enough left. Rhys looked at the single thermal pallet, the bed he usually slept in. It had a small internal power cell that generated a weak field of warmth. Not enough for the room, but enough for a body. "Get up," Rhys said, his voice rough. "You are moving to the pallet." "No," she whispered. "I am fine." "You are turning blue," Rhys said. "And I am not explaining to the marshals why I have a frozen princess in my living room." "Move." He half-dragged, half-carried her to the main pallet. He pushed her down onto it and covered her with every blanket he owned. Then, he stood there, shivering himself. The temperature was still dropping. The pallet wasn't enough on its own. Rhys looked at the shivering mound of blankets. He looked at the frost forming on the inside of the window. "Damn it," he muttered. He lay down on the pallet next to her. Lyris stiffened as she felt the mattress dip. "What? What are you doing?" "Shared body heat," Rhys said, keeping his back to her. "Survival manual. Page 1. Now stop talking and conserve energy." He felt her hesitate. Then she moved. She shifted closer to him. She was freezing, radiating cold like a block of ice. Rhys, conversely, was a furnace. His cybernetics generated excess waste heat, and his heavy frame was built for harsh winters. Lyris pressed her back against his chest. Rhys tensed. He tried to keep a respectful distance, but the pallet was narrow. She scooted backward, seeking the warmth like a plant seeking the sun. Her heels dug into his shins, her shoulders pressed against his collarbone. Then, something happened. As she began to warm up, her tactile neural lattice, the web of nerves that allowed Valerie to feel the psychic resonance of the world, woke up. Rhys felt a sudden rush of something. It wasn't just heat. It was a wave of sensation that wasn't his. He felt a frantic, fluttering heartbeat that echoed in his own chest. He felt a smell that wasn't in the room, spices and rain. He felt a profound, aching need for closeness. He realized with a jolt that he was feeling her. Lyris gasped. She tried to pull away, but the cold forced her back. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice breathless. "My lattice. It is hypersensitive. The proximity, I can feel your pulse. It is so slow, so heavy." Rhys gritted his teeth. "Block it out. I cannot," she said, her voice trembling. "You are very warm." She turned over. It was a mistake. Now they were face to face in the darkness, inches apart under the heavy pile of blankets. Rhys could see her eyes glowing faintly again as her heat returned. The pupils were dilated. The connection flared. Rhys felt a spike of desire that hit him like a physical punch. It was raw, intense, and terrifyingly biological. It was hers. She was reacting to his heat, to the safety of his presence, and her biology was confusing survival with attraction. "Lyris," Rhys warned, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. She didn't move away. She couldn't. Her hand came up, resting on his chest, right over his heart. Her fingers burned through his shirt. "You are scared," she whispered, reading him. "You are terrified of this, of me. I am terrified of you freezing to death." Reese lied. "Go to sleep." He felt her confusion, and then her embarrassment, washing over him like a blush. She pulled her hand back as if it was burning. I apologize," she murmured, turning her back to him again. "It is a biological imperative. I do not mean to." "Shut up," Reese said, but his voice was gentler this time. "Just sleep." Lyris, they lay there in the dark, bodies pressed together, the air charged with a static that had nothing to do with the storm. Reese stared at the wall, listening to the wind, and tried very hard not to think about the fact that for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't cold. The next morning, the storm had broken. The silence outside was different, lighter. The sun was trying to push through the dust haze. Reese was up before Lyris. He had fixed the heater while she slept, driven by a desperate need to restore personal boundaries. He was drinking his sludge coffee when she emerged from the blankets. They avoided eye contact. The intimacy of the night hung in the room, a heavy, unsaid thing. "Coffee?" Reese asked, holding out a mug. Lyris took it. She didn't complain about the taste this time. "Thank you," she said. She sat at the table, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. She looked tired, but the haughtiness was gone. She looked at Reese, really looked at him, and made a decision. "You deserve to know why they are hunting me," she said quietly. Reese sat down opposite her. "I am listening." Lyris took a breath. "It is not just a faction. It is the High Council, and it is your people too." She tapped the table, and a small holographic projector on her wrist, one Reese hadn't noticed, flickered to life. It displayed a series of intercepted comms logs. "I found these in the archives 3 weeks ago," she explained. "Encrypted channels between the Valyri Minister of Defense and a human corporation called Helios Dominion." Reese stiffened. Helios. They made the cybernetics in his arm. They made the guns he used to carry. "They are planning a war," Lyris said, "a manufactured one. The border skirmishes? Staged? The lost ships? Scuttled by our own black ops teams. They are creating a narrative of aggression to justify a 20% increase in military spending and the annexation of the disputed mining worlds." "It is for profit," Reese said, his voice flat. "It is always for profit. It is for control," Lyris corrected. "They want a permanent state of emergency. Fear makes people obedient. I was going to take this evidence to the diplomatic summit at Okari's Prime. I was going to present it to the Joint Assembly. But your ship exploded." Reese finished. "They sabotaged the drive core," she said. "I barely made it to the pod." She looked down at her coffee. "The worst part is that the conspiracy uses veterans, discarded soldiers from the last war, humans and Valyri who were left behind, angry and broken. They are being paid to attack their own colonies to start the fire." Reese felt a cold pit open in his stomach. He thought of Ethelgard. He thought of the mission where his squad was pinned down for 3 days because extraction never came. He thought of the intel failure that led them to bomb a civilian water processing plant. "It never made sense," Reese whispered. "We always wondered why the orders were so bad. Why we were always in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was not incompetence." "Reese," Lyris said softly. "It was choreography. You were pieces on a board." Reese stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the red dust, the anger he had buried deep, the anger he had tried to drown in silence and moisture farming, was bubbling up like magma. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't just war as hell. It was a business plan. Reese turned back to her. Lyris had stood up too. She looked exhausted, the weight of her knowledge pressing down on her slumped shoulders. She swayed slightly. Reese moved instinctively. He crossed the room and caught her as she stumbled. His flesh hand gripped her waist to steady her. She looked up at him. The emergency lights were still flickering, casting long, dancing shadows. Her eyes locked onto his. The distance between them vanished. Reese looked at her, the princess who knew how to rewire a generator, the woman who felt too much, the fugitive who was trying to stop a war. He felt the warmth of her skin through the thin shirt. "You should sit down," Reese said, but he didn't let go. "I am tired of running," Lyris whispered. Her gaze dropped to his lips, then back to his eyes. The air in the room grew thick. The memory of the heat under the blankets came rushing back. Reese felt his heart hammering against his ribs, and he knew, with her lattice, she could feel it too. He leaned in, just an inch. Beep, beep, beep. The sound was shrill and hateful. Reese froze. He pushed Lyris behind him and spun toward the console. The proximity alarm was screaming. He checked the screen. 4 distinct signatures. Fast movers. They were on the ground, approaching from the canyon ridge. "Marshals?" Lyris asked, fear spiking in her voice. Reese shook his head. "Marshals broadcast an ID signal. These are running silent." He tapped a key, magnifying the image. The camera caught a glimpse of a figure moving through the rocks. It was wearing mismatched armor, human kinetic plating mixed with Valyri sensory gear. It held a long-range disruptor rifle. Bounty hunters. Reese spat. Mixed team. Probably Helios contractors. They tracked the pod's ion trail after the storm broke. "They are here for me," Lyris said. "They are here for both of us now." Reese said. He went to the weapons locker. He punched in the code and the heavy door slid open. Inside were not just hunting rifles. There was his old service gear, the heavy repeater, the tactical vest, the concussion grenades. "Reese," Lyris said, her voice urgent. "We cannot stay here. If they pin us down in this cabin, we are dead. They will just slag the structure from orbit if they have to." "I know." Reese grabbed the vest and pulled it on over his head. The familiar weight settled on his shoulders. "We have to run," Lyris said. "The data vault, the one I told you about. It is in Havelock Station. If I can get the encryption key from there, I can broadcast the proof." "Havelock is 300 miles across the Badlands," Reese said, checking the charge on a plasma pistol. "And every mercenary in the sector is looking for you. It is suicide." "Staying here is death," Lyris countered. "At least out there, we have a chance." Reese looked at her. She was terrified. He could feel it radiating off her. But she was standing her ground. She wasn't asking him to save her. She was asking him to fight with her. He looked at his hands, the killer's hands. He had promised himself he would never pick up a gun for a cause again. He had promised he was done with missions. He looked at the monitor. The hunters were closing in. Reese let out a bitter, dry laugh. It sounded like rocks grinding together. "Just this once," he said. He reached into the back of the locker and pulled out his old helmet. He looked at Lyris. "Grab the med kit and the water rations," he ordered. "We are leaving out the back airlock." "Are you helping me?" Lyris asked, hope flaring in her eyes. "I am getting you off my property," Reese grunted, sliding a fresh magazine into his kinetic rifle. "Do not make me regret it." He tossed her a spare armor jacket. "Put this on. It is going to be a long ride." Reese Calder, a moisture farmer, died at that moment. The veteran was back. and he had a princess to save. The sun rose over the fractured landscape of Okaris like a bruised eye, swelling with purple and angry crimson light. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a static-charged silence that hummed in the teeth and made the hair on one's arms stand up. Rhys Calder kicked the starter of his hoverbike. The machine, a gargantuan slab of matte black plating and exposed intake valves that he had affectionately named the Mule, groaned in protest. It coughed, spat a cloud of blue smoke, and then settled into a rhythmic, heavy thrum that vibrated the ground beneath them. "Get on!" Rhys shouted over the engine noise. Lyris Valerian stood in the doorway of the sealed homestead, clutching the survival pack to her chest. She looked at the bike with distinct horror. It was a vehicle built for hauling ore and traversing combat zones, not for transporting royalty, and it lacked seats, fairings, or anything resembling safety restraints. "You expect me to ride that?" Lyris shouted back, stepping into the morning chill. "It looks like a piece of mining equipment that died 20 years ago." "It runs on liquid hydrogen and stubbornness," Rhys said, revving the engine. "And right now, it is the only thing faster than the hunter-seekers sweeping the grid. Get on behind me, hold on to my waist, and do not let go, or you will end up as a smear on a canyon wall." Lyris grimaced but climbed onto the rear magnetic pad. She hesitated, then wrapped her arms around Rhys's torso. Her hands fumbled over the hard lines of his tactical vest and the cold metal of his cybernetic side. Rhys felt her flinch as she touched the interface ports on his spine. "Relax," he muttered. "It does not bite." He gunned the throttle. The mule lurched forward, lifting 3 feet off the ground on a cushion of repulsor energy, and shot toward the canyon mouth. The speed was violent. They tore across the salt flats, kicking up a rooster tail of red dust that hung in the air like blood mist. Rhys drove with the aggressive confidence of a man who knew every rock and fissure of the terrain. He banked hard into the shadow of the slot canyons, using the towering walls of iron-rich shale to mask their thermal signature. The wind whipped at them, tearing at their clothes. Lyris buried her face between his shoulder blades, her grip tightening until Rhys felt the pressure even through his armor. "You are driving like a maniac," she screamed into his ear as he drifted around a hairpin turn, the bike's stabilizers scraping sparks off the canyon wall. "I am driving like a man who does not want to get shot," Rhys yelled back. "If you want a smoother ride, you can walk." "I will have you know," Lyris shouted, her voice vibrating with the rattle of the engine, "that on Valyria, travel is silent and gyroscopically stabilized. We do not vibrate our passengers into jelly." Rhys laughed, a harsh barking sound that was snatched away by the wind. "I will add the vibration to your bill. VIP transport surcharge. You are insufferable." But she didn't let go. If anything, she held on tighter, molding her body against his to escape the wind. Rhys could feel the heat of her, a steady warmth against his back that cut through the chill of the morning. For a moment, amidst the danger and the noise, he felt a strange sense of grounding. He was used to riding alone. Having her there, a terrified but furious weight, made the world feel less empty. They rode for 4 hours, pushing the mule to its limits until the engine temperature gauge flashed red. Rhys slowed them down as they approached a cluster of rusted structures clinging to the side of a mesa. It was an abandoned mining outpost, a skeleton of steel girders and collapsed silos from the first colonization wave. It was a ghost town, but it offered shade and cover. Rhys killed the engine. The silence that rushed back in was deafening. "We rest here for an hour," he said, swinging his leg over the bike and dismounting. "We need to let the heat sinks cool down before we hit the open desert." Lyris slid off the bike, her legs wobbling. She smoothed her hair, which had escaped its braid and was standing up in a wind-blown halo. "I can still feel my teeth rattling," she complained, dusting off her stolen thermal jacket. Reese pulled the kinetic rifle from the bike's scabbard. He checked the horizon, scanning for drone signatures. The sky was clear, but that didn't mean they were safe. "Come here," he said. Lyris looked at him warily. "Why?" "Because if we run into trouble, I cannot be the only one shooting," Reese said. "You have a pistol, but out here, range is everything. You need to know how to use a rifle." He held the weapon out to her. It was heavy, a blocky piece of human engineering designed to punch through ceramic plating. Lyris took it, her arms dipping under the weight. "It is unbalanced," she critiqued, hefting it, "and crude." "Where is the targeting interface?" "You are the targeting interface," Reese said. He moved behind her. He didn't think about it. It was just instruction. He stepped close, his chest brushing her back. He reached around her, his flesh hand grabbing her left forearm to adjust her grip on the barrel, his cybernetic hand guiding her right hand to the trigger guard. "Spread your feet," he murmured, his voice low near her ear. "Shoulder width. Lean into it. If you stand straight, the recoil will knock you on your ass." Lyris went still. The playful bickering of the ride evaporated. She could feel the hard planes of his armor against her spine. She could smell the scent of him, old leather, gun oil, and the sharp tang of ozone from his prosthetics. "Like this?" she asked, her voice uncharacteristically breathless. Reese adjusted her elbow, his hand lingering on her shoulder. "Tighter. Pull the stock into the pocket of your shoulder. Good. Now look down at the sights. Do not focus on the reticle, focus on the target. The reticle is just a suggestion." He was surrounded by her. The faint, spicy scent of her skin was overwhelming. He realized, with a sudden jolt, that he was standing far closer than necessary. He could see the tiny, luminescent pulses of the markings on her neck. "Reese," Lyris said softly. "Yeah?" "You are crowding me." Reese stepped back instantly, clearing his throat. He gestured at a rusted fuel drum 50 yards away. "Fire a burst. Short. Controlled." Lyris took a breath. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. The shots went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet to the left of the drum. Reese nodded. "Not bad. For a glow stick, try again." They spent 30 minutes drilling. By the end, Lyris was hitting the drum consistently, her initial disgust with the weapon replaced by a grim satisfaction. She handed the rifle back to him, rubbing her sore shoulder. "You are a good teacher," she admitted. "For a primitive." Reese slung the rifle. "And you are a quick learner. For a princess." He turned to check the bike, but as he moved, a spike of pain shot through his skull. It was blinding, white-hot agony that started at the base of his neck and exploded behind his eyes. Reese stumbled, dropping to one knee. He gritted his teeth, a guttural sound of pain escaping his throat. His cybernetic hand clenched into a fist, the servos whining loudly. "Reese!" Lyris was at his side in an instant. "What is it?" "Neural feedback," Reese gasped, squeezing his eyes shut. "The implant, it drifts. Stress makes it misfire." He fumbled for his medkit, looking for the suppressors he took to dull the connection, but his hands were shaking too badly to open the pouch. "Let me," Lyris said. "No," Reese growled. "I just need—" "Be quiet," she commanded. She knelt behind him. Her hands, cool and firm, pushed his collar aside. She touched the scarred skin at the base of his skull where the metal of the implant met the flesh. "The interface is inflamed," she murmured. "Your nervous system is rejecting the signal. I can bridge it, Do not, Reese warned. You do not know. I know bioresonance, Lyris said. Trust me. She placed her palm flat against the connection port. Reese felt a sensation like cool water pouring over a burn. The pain vanished instantly, replaced by a strange, humming clarity. But then, the barrier broke. Lyris was not using a tool, she was using her own neural lattice to ground his overload. She connected her nervous system to his. The world fell away. Reese was not in the desert. He was in a golden room that stretched for miles. The ceiling was a hologram of a perfect sky, but the air was stale. He was small. He was a child. He was sitting on a velvet cushion, surrounded by toys that floated in the air, but there were no doors. I want to go outside, the child voice echoed. I want to see the real sky. You cannot. Highness, a computerized voice answered. You are the vessel of the bloodline. You must remain pure. The world outside is dirty. It is dangerous. Reese felt the crushing weight of that isolation, the loneliness of being worshipped but never touched, the feeling of being a bird in a cage made of diamonds. Then the scene shattered. Lyris gasped as she was pulled into the current of Reese's mind. She was standing in mud. It was raining, a cold, hard rain that smelled of sulfur. She was holding a rifle. Her hands were covered in black grease. Sector 4 is clear, a voice crackled in her ear. Clean sweep. Lieutenant, no witnesses. Lyris looked down. There were bodies in the mud, civilians, farmers, not combatants. Belay that, she heard herself scream with Reese's voice. Check fire. They are non-combatants. Orders are clear. Calder, the voice on the comm said, cold and indifferent. Sanitize the zone, or we leave you here with them. She felt his horror. She felt the moment his soul cracked, the moment he realized he was not a soldier, but a murder weapon wielded by men in safe, warm offices. She felt the self-loathing that he carried like a stone in his gut, heavy and radioactive. Reese! Lyris screamed his name, tearing her hand away from his neck. The link severed with a physical snap. They both sprawled backward in the red dust, gasping for air. Reese stared at her, his eyes wide and wild. Lyris was trembling, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was thick with the things they had seen. You, Lyris whispered, her voice shaking. You tried to stop them. Reese wiped a hand across his face. He felt exposed, flayed open. Get out of my head. Lyris, I saw it, she pressed, crawling closer to him. You were not the butcher they say you are. You were. Horrified. And I still followed orders, Reese roared, the anger masking his shame. I still watched it happen. That is what I am. Lyris. That is the man you are trusting with your life. Lyris looked at him. She didn't look away. I saw a boy in a golden room, Reese said quietly, deflecting, who just wanted to see the sky. Lyris flinched. That was a long time ago. We are both damaged goods, Reese said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. We are both just pieces of equipment that did not work the way we were supposed to. Lyris reached out. She hesitated, then placed her hand on his flesh arm. She didn't use her powers. She just held him. Maybe, she said softly. Or maybe we are just finally waking up. They sat there as the sun climbed higher, the bond between them shifting from one of necessity to one of profound, terrifying understanding. But the galaxy did not care about their epiphanies. The first warning was the sound of a sonic boom cracking the sky. Reese looked up. Incoming! A drop pod slammed into the mesa ridge 300 yards above them. Dust plumed. Then another pod hit. Then a third. Reese grabbed Lyris and hauled her to her feet. They found us. From the smoke of the impact craters, shapes emerged. They were not men. They were quadrupedal machines, synthetic hounds, sleek and silver, with sensory clusters for heads and razor-sharp vibrissae. They moved with fluid, terrifying speed, scrambling down the vertical rock face. Behind them came the handlers, mercenaries in jump jets, descending in controlled arcs. "Cover!" Reese yelled, shoving Lyris toward the ruins of a crushing mill. They dove behind a slab of rusting durasteel just as the first wave of plasma fire chewed up the ground where they had been standing. Reese popped up, shouldering his rifle, and he didn't aim, he just fired. His cybernetic eye calculated the trajectory, the windage, the lead time. Crack thump, crack thump. Two of the synthetic hounds exploded in showers of sparks and hydraulic fluid. "Keep moving," Reese shouted. "Head for the tunnels." Lyris scrambled alongside him. A hound leaped over a pile of rubble, its jaws snapping inches from her face. Lyris didn't freeze. She spun, her eyes flaring with violet light. She thrust her hand forward, a blade of pure psionic energy, a hard light construct fueled by her will, erupted from her wrist emitter. She slashed outward. The energy blade sheared through the hound's neck plating like it was paper. The machine collapsed, twitching. Reese glanced back, seeing the move. "Nice trick. I have my moments," she yelled back, panting. They reached the mouth of the mine shaft, but a figure dropped from the sky, landing with a heavy thud that cracked the concrete. It was a human male, encased in heavy assault armor painted with the jagged red stripes of the Bloodpack Bounty Guild. He stood up slowly, a rotary cannon spinning up on his arm. At the end of the line, the bounty hunter boomed, his voice amplified. Reese pushed Lyris behind him. He raised his rifle, but he knew he was outgunned. The rotary cannon could turn this entire entrance into Swiss cheese. The bounty hunter stepped forward, his helmet retracting to reveal a scarred, bearded face. He squinted at Reese. He paused. The rotary cannon stopped spinning. "Well, I will be damned," the hunter said, a slow, cruel grin spreading across his face. "I thought you were dead." Reese stayed silent, his finger tight on the trigger. "You do not recognize me, do you?" The hunter laughed. "Ethelgard. I was in the 4th bat. We cleaned up your mess." "Commander." Reese went cold. "Commander Calder." The hunter mocked, savoring the name. "The ghost of the Outer Rim. The man who does not exist." Lyris looked at Reese, shock registering on her face. "Commander?" "I heard you went rogue," the hunter said, raising his weapon again. "I heard you grew a conscience. That is a dangerous thing for a weapon to have. Calder." Reese didn't wait for the speech to end. He saw the fuel valve on the wall next to the hunter. It was painted red, flammable. He didn't shoot the hunter. He shot the valve. The pressurized gas line ruptured. The gas hit the spark of the rotary cannon's motor. The explosion was a concussive wave of heat and noise. The hunter was thrown backward, engulfed in a ball of flame. The entrance to the mine collapsed in a cascade of rock and twisted metal. "Go!" Reese grabbed Lyris's hand. They sprinted into the dark of the tunnels, the roar of the fire behind them masking their escape. They ran until their lungs burned, navigating the labyrinth of old shafts by the light of Lyris's glowing markings and Reese's night vision. They emerged an hour later from a ventilation output on the far side of the mesa. The sun was setting now, casting long, jagged shadows across the desert. They collapsed in a shallow cave, hidden from the air. Reese leaned back against the rock wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt. He checked his ammo. 3 rounds left. Lyris watched him. She was covered in dust, her imperial armor scuffed and scorched, but her eyes were clear. "Commander," she said softly. Reese didn't look at her. "Do not." "You led them," she said, The ghost units. The ones they say never existed. Reese looked up. His face was a mask of exhaustion. Yes, I was the CO. We were plausible deniables. When the Council or the Dominion wanted something done that violated the treaties, they sent us. And when Ethelgard happened, when we refused to fire on the refugees, they triggered the orbital bombardment anyway, and they blamed us. They said we went rogue. They wiped my unit's records. They tried to wipe us. He looked at his cybernetic hand. I was the only one who walked away. He waited for her to recoil. He waited for disgust. He waited for the princess to realize she was traveling with a monster. Lyris stood up. She walked over to him. She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the filth. That man was back there. She said, he saw a target. He saw a legend. She reached out and took his human hand in hers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. I see the man who pulled me out of a burning pod, she said fiercely. I see the man who taught me to shoot so I could survive. I see the man who just blew up a mine shaft to save my life. Reese looked at her. You should run. Lyris, I am a liability. You are my partner. She corrected. The air in the cave changed. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, leaving behind a raw, vibrating need. They were alive. They were close. The space between them seemed to shrink. Reese looked at her mouth. He couldn't help it. Lyris saw the look. Her breath hitched. You are dangerous, Reese, she whispered, leaning in. But not for the reasons you think. We cannot do this, Reese rasped, though he didn't pull away. Why? She challenged, her face inches from his. Because of the war? Because of your rank? Because I am a princess and you are a soldier? Because if I kiss you, Reese said, his voice rough with honesty, I am going to lose the only edge I have left. I cannot afford to care about you. Lyris, it will get us killed. Lyris let out a shaky laugh. You fool, she whispered. You already care. She closed the gap. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the crash of two worlds slamming together. Reese's hand tangled in her white hair, pulling her closer. Lyris's arms went around his neck, pulling him down. It was desperate and hungry, fueled by the near-death experience and the raw intimacy of the mind link. It tasted of dust and fear and a terrifying hope. For a moment, there was no war. There was no conspiracy. There was just the heat of her skin and the desperate pressure of her mouth on his. Then, reality crashed back in. Reese broke the kiss. He pulled back, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. He gripped her shoulders, pushing her gently away. Stop, he gasped. Stop. Lyris stared at him, her lips swollen, her eyes wide and dark. She looked like she had been struck. We have a mission, Reese said, his voice shaking. We have to get to Havelock, but we have to stop a war, and we cannot... This is a distraction. Lyris pulled away from him. She stood up, wrapping her arms around herself. Her face was flushed, her expression a mix of hurt and defiance. A distraction? She repeated. Is that what I am? A logistical error? You know what I mean, Reese said, standing up. He felt unsteady, as if the ground were shifting. I know that you are a coward. Reese called her, she said, her voice trembling. You will fight an army of bounty hunters, but you are terrified of one moment of real feeling. Maybe I am, Reese admitted, because feelings get people killed. He picked up his rifle. He walked to the mouth of the cave, refusing to look at her. Get your gear, he said, his voice flat again. We have 10 miles to the city perimeter. Lyris watched him for a moment. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Fine, she said coolly. We will walk. But do not think you can order this away. Commander, I am not one of your soldiers. They left the cave in silence, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. They crested the final ridge 2 hours later. Below them, sprawling across the valley floor like a smear of electric paint, was Havelock Station. It was a chaotic mess of neon lights, smog, and towering skyscrapers that looked like jagged teeth biting into the night sky. Holographic billboards advertised casinos, off-world transport, and cheap synthetic pleasures. It was loud, dirty, and teeming with life. Somewhere down there, in the belly of the beast, was the Helios Dominion branch office and the data vault. Reese looked at the city, then glanced sideways at Lyris. She was staring at the lights, her jaw set, her spine straight. She looked regal even in rags. "Ready?" he asked. Lyris didn't look at him. She checked the charge on her pistol. "Let us go start a riot," she said. Reese watched her start down the slope. He touched his lips, where the ghost of her warmth still lingered. He adjusted his grip on his rifle and followed her into the neon dark. Havelock Station was not a city so much as it was a collision of desperation and neon. It was a sprawling, vertical hive of durasteel clamped onto the edge of a canyon, covered in a perpetual dome of smog that trapped the heat and the noise. Holographic billboards the size of starships floated in the haze, advertising synthetic organs, cut-rate warp drives, and zero-gravity pleasure dens. The air smelled of ozone, fried street food, and unwashed bodies. Reese Calder hated it. It reminded him of everything he had moved to the frontier to escape. He adjusted the collar of his stolen heavy coat, pulling it higher to hide his face. Beside him, Lyris moved with a grace that was impossible to fully disguise, though she was dressed in oversized mechanic's coveralls and a hood that shadowed her luminous features. "Keep your head down," Reese muttered, steering her through the crushing crowd of humans, Valerie, and various spacer species, "and stop looking at everything like you want to buy it or dissect it." "I am merely observing," Lyris whispered back, though her eyes were wide, tracking the frantic energy of the street. "It is vibrant and incredibly dirty." "Why is the ground sticky?" "Do not ask," Reese said grimly. They passed a street vendor selling skewered meat of indeterminate origin. A group of street urchins, skinny kids with cybernetic ocular implants, ran past them, laughing. One of them bumped into Reese. Reese's flesh hand shot out, catching the kid by the scruff of his jacket before he could vanish into the crowd. Reese reached into the kid's pocket and pulled out his own credit chit. "Nice try," Reese said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He tossed the chit back to the kid, adding a small, high-value coin from his own stash. "Buy some real food. Do not spend it on stamps." The kid stared at him, eyes wide, then grabbed the coin and sprinted away. Lyris watched the exchange with a smirk she didn't bother to hide. "You are terrifying, Commander," she teased. "Pure dad energy. You handle street orphans with the same grumpy efficiency you use on bounty hunters." "I am not grumpy," Reese snapped, pushing through a turnstile. "I am vigilant, and dad energy is not a tactical term. It suits you." She laughed softly. Their attempts to blend in hit a snag 10 minutes later in a crowded transit bar where they stopped to get water. The place was a dive, vibrating with bass-heavy music and the roar of miners blowing their paychecks. A large, drunken miner with hydraulic arms slammed his drink down next to Lyris. He leaned in, leering at the curve of her jaw beneath the hood. "Hey, shine doll," he slurred, using a derogatory term for Valerie. "How about you and me go out back and I show you how a real species parties? You look like you need to get hammered." Lyris stiffened. She turned to him, her expression one of polite confusion. I have no desire to be struck with a hammer, she said clearly, her voice cutting through the noise. That sounds incredibly inefficient and painful. Why would you suggest such a thing? The bar went quiet. The miner blinked, his brain processing the literal interpretation. He decided she was mocking him. You think you are funny? He growled, reaching for her. Reese was moving before the miner's hand cleared the table. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply stepped in, grabbed the miner's hydraulic wrist, and applied pressure to a specific nerve cluster while twisting the servo joint backward. The miner screamed as his own arm locked up, forcing him to his knees. She takes things literally, Reese said to the room, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of violence. And she is not interested. He shoved the miner back into his chair and grabbed Lyris by the arm. We are leaving, he said. Outside, in the rain-slicked alley. Lyris pulled her arm free. I could have handled him, she said, adjusting her hood. I was preparing a synaptic disruption pulse. And then every sensor in the sector would have lit up, Reese said, exasperated. You cannot just melt the brain of everyone who offers you a drink. Lyris. He offered me a hammer, she argued. It is an idiom. Reese rubbed his temples. It means getting intoxicated. You have to learn the local dialect or we are going to get arrested for assault before we even reach the safe house. I find human dialect confusing and violent. She huffed. Reese looked at her, indignant, royal, and completely out of her depth, and felt a laugh bubble up in his chest. He suppressed it, but a smile cracked his stoic mask. Come on, Your Highness, he said, shaking his head. Jax is waiting, and try not to accept any offers to get smashed, trashed, or wasted. They all mean the same thing. They found Jax's shop deep in the lower levels, sandwiched between a salvage yard and a cooling tower. The sign out front simply said parts, with the P flickering ominously. Reese keyed a code into the rusted panel. The door slid open with a grind of metal on metal. Inside, the shop was a chaotic wonderland of scavenged tech. Droid chassis hung from the ceiling like carcasses. Stacks of warp cores hummed on shelves. Sitting behind a workbench, soldering a neural interface, was a man who looked more machine than flesh. Jax had lost his legs and one eye on Ethelgard. Now he moved on spider-like cybernetic limbs, and his left eye was a multispectral sensor cluster that glowed red. We are closed, Jax grumbled without looking up. Unless you have a fusion coil for a Class 4 hauler. Get out. Hello to you too, Jax, Reese said, stepping into the light. Jax froze. The soldering iron dropped from his hand. He spun his chair around, the servos whirring. His sensor eye dilated, focusing on Reese. Reese? Jax whispered. His voice was gravel in disbelief. You are dead. I saw the report. KIA in the canyon sector. I got better, Reese said. Jax let out a roar of laughter and scrambled over the counter, his metal legs clinking on the floor. He grabbed Reese in a bear hug that would have crushed a normal man's ribs. You son of a bitch, Jax yelled, slapping Reese on the back. I knew it. I told them you were too ugly to die. He pulled back, grinning. Then his sensors locked onto Lyris standing in the shadows. The grin vanished. He reached for the heavy blaster under the counter. Reese, Jax said slowly. Why is there a Valerie in my shop? And why is her biosignature reading as Imperial royalty? Jax. Stand down, Reese said, putting a hand on his friend's arm. She is with me. This is Lyris. The Princess Lyris? Jax looked between them, his mechanical eye whirring as it zoomed in. The one the news feeds say is a terrorist. Reese, tell me you did not kidnap a princess. I rescued her, Reese corrected, and we need your help. Jax stared at them for a long moment, then sighed and holstered the blaster. Of course you do, he muttered. It is never a social call. It is always Jax. I need a gun, or Jax. I need to overthrow a government. Coffee is in the back. It is fresh. Over mugs of actual non-sludge coffee. Laris explained the data. Jax listened, his expression darkening as she spoke about Helios Dominion and the Valyri Council. I knew it, Jax spat, slamming his mug down. I knew something was rotting. I have seen the shipments, Rhys. Black-boxed crates moving through the cargo hub at midnight. Marked as medical supplies, but they scan as bioorganic compounds. Bioweapons? Rhys asked. And worse, Jax said. I have seen personnel transfers. Contract workers from the border colonies, they are shipping people, Rhys. Humans and Valyri alike. Slave labor for the secret fabrication plants. Lyris looked sick. The High Council outlawed indentured labor 3 centuries ago. The Council lies, Jax said bluntly. Money speaks louder than treaties. Princess, we need to get into the Helios data vault, Rhys said. The proof is there. Jax whistled. The vault? That is under the main branch office. Security is tight. DNA scanners, thermal grids, automated turrets. You cannot just walk in? No, Rhys said. But we can ride in. Jax grinned, a wicked metal-toothed expression. The maglev maintenance lines. Exactly. Rhys nodded. The plan was insane, which meant it was the only option they had. 2 hours later, they were in the maintenance tunnels beneath the city. The air was thick with the smell of grease and high-voltage electricity. The roar of the maglev trains passing overhead shook the dust from the ceiling. Jax had outfitted them with stealth suits, matte black nanofiber that absorbed light and dampened their thermal output. He had also given Lyris a wrist-mounted interface spike, a piece of illegal hacking tech modified to work with her neural lattice. The cargo line runs directly under the vault, Jax explained over the comms. He was back at the shop, monitoring the grid. There is a service hatch at Sector 49. You have a 3-minute window between trains to breach the hatch and get up into the server room. Rhys led the way. He moved with the silent lethality of his old life, checking corners, his rifle raised. Lyris followed, her movements fluid and anxious. They reached the access point. A massive cargo train screamed past, a blur of steel and wind that nearly knocked them off the catwalk. Now! Rhys yelled. He jumped onto the tracks. Sprinting toward the service hatch in the ceiling of the tunnel, he boosted Lyris up. She grabbed the ledge and pulled herself into the crawl space. Rhys followed, hauling himself up just as the lights of the next train flooded the tunnel. They were in. The ventilation shafts led them to the sub-basement of the Helios Tower. They dropped down into a corridor lined with server banks that hummed with the collective data of a trillion-credit corporation. Guards, Rhys hissed, pulling Lyris into the shadows. 2 Helios security officers, armored, faceless, patrolled the intersection. Rhys waited until they passed, then moved. He didn't use his gun. He used the silence. He was on them before they turned. A blur of motion, a strike to the neck, a sweep of the leg. They were unconscious before they hit the floor. Rhys dragged them out of sight. Lyris watched, pale but resolute. "You are very good at that," she whispered. "Practice," Rhys said shortly. The vault is ahead. The door to the data vault was a slab of black glass. No handle, no keypad, just a biometric scanner and a neural interface port. "This is it," Rhys said, taking up a defensive position. It is a hybrid lock, human encryption wrapped in Valyri psychic wards. Lyris stepped forward. She raised her wrist, the interface spike gleaming. She placed her hand on the glass. "Cover me," she said. "This will be loud in the ether." She closed her eyes. Her markings flared brilliant violet. Reese watched the corridor, his heart hammering. He could feel the pressure of her mind working, a static charge that made his teeth ache. On the glass, lines of code began to scroll wildly. The psychic wards fought back, red glyphs burning on the surface, but Lyris pushed through them. She wasn't just hacking. She was dueling the machine spirit of the lock. "Got it," she gasped, sweat beading on her forehead. The glass hissed and slid open. They stepped inside. The room was circular, dominated by a central holographic column. Data streams swirled in the air like a digital tornado. Lyris moved to the console. Her fingers flew across the hard light keys. "I am searching for the encrypted files," she said. "The border conflict. The budget allocations. Here." She pulled a file into the main display. It expanded, filling the room with schematics and memos. Reese read the text, his blood running cold. It was all there: the staged attacks, the payments to pirate fleets, the projected profit margins from a 20-year war. They had monetized the apocalypse. "Look at the signatories," Reese said, pointing to the bottom of the document. Lyris scrolled down. Defense Minister Kova, CEO Aris, and... She stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered. There, glowing in blue text, was the seal of the third house and the signature of High Counselor Valerian. Her father. "It cannot be," she choked out. He taught me that duty was sacred. He claimed he wanted peace." "He wanted power," Reese said gently, stepping closer to her. "Lyris, I am sorry." "He sold us," she said, her voice trembling with a shattering grief. "He sold his own people. He tried to have me killed because I was going to ruin his profit margin." She looked at Reese, her eyes swimming with tears. "My whole life. It was a lie." The palace was not a home. It was a boardroom. Reese wanted to hold her, but the console flashed red, access unauthorized. A mechanical voice announced, "Fail-safe trigger." The room bathed in crimson light. Sirens began to wail, a deafening, rhythmic shriek. "They knew we were coming," Reese shouted. "It was a trap. Download the data," Reese yelled, spinning toward the door. "I will hold the corridor." Lyris wiped her eyes, her grief instantly replaced by a cold, hard fury. She slammed the data drive into the port, copying. Reese took a knee at the doorway, leveling his rifle. The elevator at the end of the hall pinged. The doors opened. It wasn't security guards. It was a kill team. 6 soldiers in stealth armor, moving with supernatural synchronization, and leading them was a figure that made Reese freeze. He was a Valyri male, 7 feet tall, wearing the black and gold armor of the Imperial Guard. His face was a roadmap of scars, and he held a curved energy lance. "General Kalen." Lyris gasped from the console. The general stopped 10 meters away. He looked past Reese, his gaze locking on Lyris. "You have played your part well, wayward daughter," Kalen said. His voice was like sliding tectonic plates. "You led us right to the leak in our security." "You work for my father?" Lyris spat, the download bar hitting 90%. "You are a traitor to the Empire." "I am a patriot," Kalen replied. "The Empire stagnates. War is the crucible in which we are forged anew. Surrender, princess. Your father wishes for you to be returned, re-educated." Reese fired. The shot caught Kalen in the chest plate, staggering him, but the personal shield flared and absorbed the impact. "Run!" Reese roared. Lyris grabbed the drive. "Done!" Reese unleashed a hail of suppressive fire, forcing the kill team into cover. He threw a concussion grenade, the blast shaking the hallway and filling it with smoke. He grabbed Lyris and they sprinted for the service exit. They burst out into the maintenance tunnels, but the enemy was fast. Energy bolts sizzled past them, melting the Durasteel walls. "Up!" Reese yelled. "The ventilation shaft!" They scrambled up a ladder, emerging onto the roof of the Helios Tower. The rain was pouring down now, a torrential deluge that soaked them instantly. The city sprawled below them, a dizzying drop of 200 stories. "There," Lyris pointed, a landing pad on the adjacent tower. But between them was a gap of 50 feet. "We have to jump," Reese yelled over the wind. Before they could move, the roof access door blew off its hinges. Kalen stepped out, flanked by his squad, nowhere to run. Human. Kalen boomed. Reese looked at the gap, then he looked at Lyris. "You can make that jump," he said. "Your physiology. You are stronger." "What about you?" Lyris screamed. Reese turned back to the enemy. He racked the slide on his rifle. "I am the distraction," he said. "Go! No!" Lyris grabbed his arm. "I cannot make the jump." "Lyris!" Reese shouted. "I will hold them off. Get the data to Jax. Go!" He pushed her toward the edge and turned, opening fire on the advancing squad. He took a hit to the shoulder, his armor sparking, but he kept shooting. He was going to die here, and he was okay with that. He was finally fighting for something that mattered. But Lyris did not jump. She screamed, a sound of pure psychic rage. She raised both hands. Her markings flared so bright they were blinding white. A shockwave of telekinetic force erupted from her. It hit the squad like a freight train. The soldiers were lifted off their feet and hurled backward. Kalen dug his lance into the roof, groaning as the force threatened to tear him loose. Reese stared at her. She was glowing, floating inches off the deck, her hair whipping in a wind of her own making. "We go together," she screamed. She grabbed Reese's hand. "Jump!" They ran. They leaped into the void. Gravity took them. They fell toward the neon abyss. But Lyris didn't let go. She focused her power, creating a cushion of air, a telekinetic glider. They slammed onto the landing pad of the next tower, rolling across the wet metal. They scrambled up, gasping. "Speeder!" Reese pointed to a parked luxury craft. He blew the lock with a single shot. They dived in. Reese hot-wired the ignition while Lyris fired her pistol at the figures appearing on the roof they had just left. The engine screamed to life. Reese gunned it, and they shot away into the traffic lanes, weaving between massive cargo haulers and commuter drones. The chase that followed was a blur of near misses and high-speed violence. Kalen's squad pursued them in interceptors. Lasers scorched the hull of their speeder. Reese drove with cold precision, diving into the lower levels and scraping paint off the buildings. "We cannot shake them," Lyris yelled, checking the rear sensors. "They are tracking our heat signature. Then we blind them," Reese shouted. "The transit tunnel." He banked hard, diving into an unfinished maglev tunnel. It was a dead end, blocked by construction shielding miles ahead, but it was narrow. Reese slammed on the brakes, spinning the speeder around to face the entrance. The pursuers were seconds behind. "Lyris," Reese said, his voice calm. "Can you overload your interface?" "What?" "The interface spike. If you push your full psychic output through it, can you create an EMP?" "It will burn out the interface," Lyris said. "It might burn out my nervous system." "Do it," Reese said. "It is the only way." The interceptors roared into the tunnel. Lyris closed her eyes. She grabbed the dashboard. She didn't hold back. She poured every ounce of her fear, her rage, and her power into the machine. The air crackled. Static electricity arced across her skin. "Now!" Reese yelled. Lyris screamed. A sphere of blue energy exploded from the speeder. It washed over the oncoming interceptors. Their engines died instantly. Their lights went black. They crashed into the tunnel walls, crumpling like tin cans. The waves kept going. The lights in the tunnel died. The lights in the sector above flickered and went out. Half of Havelock Station plunged into darkness. Rhys and Lyris sat in the dead speeder, breathing hard in the sudden, absolute dark. "We are alive," Rhys whispered. Lyris slumped against him, drained. Rhys didn't wait. He popped the canopy. "We have to move. The backup grids will come online in 10 minutes. They abandoned the speeder and disappeared into the shadows of the Undercity, moving toward the safe house Jax had prepared. The safe house was a small, windowless apartment in a derelict hab block. It was cold, but it was secure. Rhys locked the door and engaged the heavy deadbolts. He leaned his back against the metal, sliding down until he hit the floor. He ripped off his helmet and threw it across the room. Lyris stood in the center of the room. She was shaking. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. She looked at her hands, trembling, stained with grease and soot. "My father," she whispered. Rhys stood up. He crossed the room. He didn't hesitate this time. He wrapped his arms around her. Lyris collapsed into him. She didn't cry. She just held on, gripping his armor so tight her knuckles turned white. She buried her face in his neck. "I have nothing left," she said into his skin. "My family. My home. It is all poison." "You have this," Rhys said fiercely, pulling back to look at her. "You have the truth, and you are still standing." Lyris looked up at him. In the dim light of the emergency glow rod, Rhys saw the raw vulnerability in her eyes. She didn't look like a princess. She looked like a survivor. "Rhys," she breathed. She kissed him. This time. Rhys didn't pull away. He couldn't. The barrier he had built, the soldier's discipline, the fear of loss, shattered under the weight of the night. He kissed her back with a desperation that matched her own. It wasn't gentle. It was a claim. It was an affirmation that they were still alive, that they were still warm in a cold universe. They stumbled backward, hitting the narrow cot in the corner. Rhys's hands found the clasps of her armor, stripping away the hard ceramic to find the soft, warm skin beneath. Lyris's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him down to her. There were no words. There was only the friction of skin, the frantic beat of hearts, and the desperate need to be close, to be one thing that couldn't be broken. For hours, the galaxy outside ceased to exist. There was no conspiracy, no war, no bounties. There was only the curve of her hip, the scar on his shoulder, the sound of their breath in the dark. They held on to each other as if the world might end if they let go. Later. Much later. The silence returned. They lay tangled together under a thin blanket. The emergency light cast long shadows on the walls. Rhys traced the line of Lyris's spine with his flesh hand. Her markings were dim now, a soft, pulsing blue that matched the rhythm of her breathing. He stared at the ceiling. "You know," he said, his voice raspy and quiet. "According to Sector Law 49, I am officially harboring a Class A enemy royal fugitive. That is a mandatory death sentence." Lyris shifted, resting her chin on his chest. She looked at him, her eyes clear and resolute. "The law is written by liars," she said softly. She ran a finger down the metal of his cybernetic arm, tracing the junction where it met his skin. "I am not your enemy. Rhys." "Not anymore." Rhys turned his head to look at her. He saw the woman who had jumped off a roof for him, the woman who had burned down her own life to save millions. "No," he said, pulling her closer. "You are not." He kissed her forehead. "Sleep. Lyris. Tomorrow. We burn it all down, outside, in the distance." Sirens began to wail as the city woke up to the chaos they had caused. But inside the room, for the first time in 20 years, Reese Calder was not afraid of the dark. The morning sun over Havelock Station did not bring light. It brought a gray, suffocating haze that smelled of burnt circuitry and ozone. The city was in convulsions. The blackout Reese and Lyris had engineered the night before had shattered the fragile order of the frontier metropolis. From the window of their safe house, a cramped maintenance unit high in a derelict hab block, they watched the chaos unfold. Plumes of black smoke rose from the lower levels where looting had broken out. Police drones buzzed through the smog like angry hornets, their spotlights cutting through the gloom. On the wall, a cracked holographic display projected the morning news. The feed was a disjointed mess of panic and propaganda. Terrorist attack on Havelock Grid. The headline screamed in bold red letters. The anchor, a woman with severe features and a frantic cadence, was reading from a script that Reese recognized instantly. It was the standard crisis narrative used by the Dominion. Authorities have identified the perpetrators as a rogue cell of anti-human extremists. The anchor said, reports indicate they may be working in concert with radical Valyri separatists. Citizens are advised to remain indoors. Martial law is in effect. Reese turned away from the screen, his jaw set. They are spinning it, he said, his voice rough with sleep and tension. They are using the blackout to stoke the fear. By tonight, every human on this station will be looking for an alien to blame. Lyris sat at the small metal table, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the stolen data drive. She looked exhausted, her white hair pulled back in a severe knot, but her eyes were sharp as she scrolled through the decrypted files. "It is worse than that," she said quietly. "Reese, look at this timestamp." Reese walked over, leaning one hand on the back of her chair. He looked at the schematic she had pulled up. It was a tactical overlay of a space station, a massive rotating wheel of glass and steel. "Orbital Concord," Reese said. "The Joint Peace Station. It is neutral territory." "Not anymore," Lyris said. "Look at the cargo manifest." Reese squinted at the scrolling text. Amidst the lists of hydroponic supplies and diplomatic envoys, there was a flagged shipment authorized by the Valyri High Council and Helios Dominion Security. Projected delivery, 1,400 hours today. Contents, Class 4 kinetic charges, aerosolized nanophage. Reese felt the blood drain from his face. A nanophage, that is a bioweapon. It targets specific genetic markers. "If they detonate that on Orbital Concord," Lyris said, her voice trembling with suppressed rage, "it will kill every human diplomat on the station while leaving the Valyri unharmed. Or vice versa, depending on how they calibrate it." It is a false flag, Reese realized, the soldiers' logic slotting the pieces together. They are going to slaughter the peace delegation and make it look like a targeted assassination. It will not just start a war. It will demand a war of extermination. "We have 4 hours, Lyris said, standing up. "The shipment docks at 1400. The broadcast array is in the central spire. If we can get there, if I can plug this drive directly into the station's core, I can override the local jamming. I can broadcast the truth to every ship, station, and planet in the sector." Reese looked at her. She was wearing ill-fitting scavenger clothes, tired and hunted, yet she stood with the posture of a queen preparing for execution. "Then we need a ride," Reese said. A heavy pounding on the door made them both jump. Reese had his pistol drawn before the second knock echoed. "Open up! It is me!" Jax's voice came through the steel, sounding muffled and urgent. Reese unbolted the door. Jax stumbled in, his cybernetic legs clanking loudly. He looked like he had been dragged through a grease trap. You two are the most expensive friends I have ever had, Jax grumbled, throwing a heavy keycard onto the table. Did you get it? Reese asked. Jax nodded, collapsing onto a crate. A diplomatic courier shuttle, stolen from the impound lot 3 sectors over. I forged the transponder codes. As far as traffic control is concerned, you are Envoy Unit Alpha 9, carrying urgent diplomatic communiques to the summit. You are a miracle worker, Jax, Lyris said, reaching for the card. I am a dead man walking, Jax corrected. Helios Security is tearing the city apart looking for you. They have kill teams at every spaceport gate. Then it is a good thing we are not using the gates, Reese said, checking the charge on his rifle. Jax looked at Reese, then at Lyris. He saw the way they stood near each other, an unconscious gravitation that hadn't been there yesterday. He grinned, a flash of metal teeth. So you two finally stopped arguing long enough to figure it out, huh? Reese ignored him, checking his gear. We are leaving. Jax, go to the ground. Do not let them find you. Jax stood up, offering a mechanical hand. Give them hell, Commander. For Ethelgard, Reese said, gripping the metal hand. The shuttle was small, sleek, and smelled of sterile air freshener. It was a luxury craft compared to the hoverbike or the mining hauler. But the atmosphere inside was thick with tension. As they broke orbit, leaving the smog of Havelock behind, the stars stretched out before them, a vast, indifferent ocean of black and white. Orbital Concord hung in the distance, a gleaming jewel against the void. Reese set the autopilot and turned his chair to face Lyris. She was pacing the small cabin, muttering to herself. She stopped, cleared her throat, and raised her chin. People of the galaxy, she announced to the empty air, her voice ringing with formal authority. We have been deceived. The blood spilled on our borders is not the result of hatred, but of greed. She paused, frowning. Is that too stiff? It feels too imperial. Reese watched her, arms crossed over his chest. He was trying to memorize the way the starlight caught the curve of her cheekbone. It is a little stiff, he admitted. You sound like you are reading a proclamation to a room full of statues. Lyris sighed, dropping the regal posture. I am trying to sound like a leader. Reese, if I go on that feed looking like a frightened fugitive, no one will believe me. I need to command their attention. You have a terrifying princess stare, Reese said. Deadpan. Use that. My what? Lyris blinked. The stare, Reese explained, gesturing vaguely at his face. You do that thing where you narrow your eyes and your bioluminescence flares up and you look like you are about to orbital bombard someone's soul. It is very effective. Use that. Lyris let out a short, surprised laugh. You find it terrifying? I find it compelling, Reese corrected. The humor faded as quickly as it had come. Lyris looked out the viewport at the approaching station. Her reflection in the glass was ghostly. Reese, she said softly. What happens if we succeed? Reese uncrossed his arms. What do you mean? I mean, if I expose the council, if I expose my father, and I cannot go home. I will be a traitor to my caste. I will be the woman who dismantled the Empire's hierarchy. You will be a hero, Reese said. Heroes are often exiled, she countered. She turned to face him, her eyes searching for him. And you? You are a human veteran. I am a Valyri royal. Even if we stop the war, the galaxy is not ready for us. She gestured between them. I will be forced into a diplomatic marriage to stabilize the factions, she whispered, the fear raw in her voice. Or I will be sent away for my own protection. This, what we have, it is an impossible miracle. Reese, It cannot last beyond this ship. Reese looked at her. He felt the old instinct to pull away, to armor himself against the pain of loss. He had spent 20 years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. He stood up and crossed the small space between them. He took her hands. "Lyris," he said, his voice low and steady. "Before you crashed on my moon, I was already dead. I was just waiting for my body to catch up." He squeezed her hands. "You gave me a reason to fight for something other than just staying alive. You woke me up. I do not care what the galaxy thinks. I do not care about politics. If we get out of this, I am not going anywhere." Lyris looked at him, tears welling in her star-flecked eyes. She reached up, touching his scarred cheek. "Then let us make sure we get out of this," she whispered. The shuttle docked at orbital concord with a smooth, mechanical thud. The airlock cycled, and they stepped into the belly of the beast. The station was a masterpiece of diplomacy. The corridors were wide, carpeted in deep blue and lined with statues representing the history of both species. But underneath the luxury, Reese could feel the vibration of the station's massive reactors. They moved through the crowds, heads down. Reese wore the dress uniform of a diplomatic security officer, stolen from the shuttle's locker, while Lyris was draped in a heavy hooded cloak that obscured her face and markings. The tension was palpable. Soldiers from both the Valyria Imperial Guard and the Human Coalition Navy patrolled the halls, eyeing each other with suspicion. They reached a security checkpoint. A Valyria attendant, a young male with soft features, held up a hand to stop them. "Identification," he said. Reese stiffened, his hand drifting toward the pistol concealed under his jacket. Lyris stepped forward. She lowered her hood just an inch, enough for her eyes and the royal markings on her throat to be visible to him, but shielded from the cameras. She stared at him, the terrifying princess stare. The attendant froze. His eyes went wide. He recognized her. The missing princess, the fugitive. Reese tensed, ready to silence him. The attendant looked at Lyris, then at the guards behind him. He looked back at Lyris, and in his eyes there was no malice, only a sudden dawning hope. He cleared his throat. "Documents are in order," he said loudly. "You may proceed. Envoy." He stepped aside, keeping his head bowed. Lyris nodded once, a tiny gesture of gratitude, and they swept past. "He knew," Reese whispered as they turned the corner. "He chose," Lyris corrected. "Not everyone wants this war." Reese. They reached the central atrium, a massive open space that looked down on the station's reactor core through a floor of transparent aluminum. Below them, engineers were working on the main power coupling. Reese stopped. He pulled out a small scanning device Jax had given him. He aimed it at the core. The reading spiked red. "They are not fixing the power," Reese said, his voice cold. "That is the bomb. They are rigging the reactor to overload. The nanophage canisters are strapped to the coolant lines. When the core goes, the ventilation system will spread the virus instantly." "We have to move," Lyris said. "The broadcast array is in the upper spire. The elevator is there. Wait." Reese grabbed her arm. "Look." He pointed across the atrium. Standing on a balcony overlooking the core were two figures. One was a Valyria counselor draped in silver robes. The other was a human man in a crisp white admiral's uniform. He was older, his hair gray, but his posture was ramrod straight. Reese felt the world tilt. "Admiral Kerrigan," he breathed. Lyris looked at him. "Your commanding officer, the one who sent you to Ethelgard, the one who signed my death warrant," Reese said. "The one who told my family I was KIA, he is here. He is coordinating the attack." Reese stared at the man who had destroyed his life. A cold, lethal calm settled over him. The plan changes. Reese said, "What?" Lyris grabbed his lapel. "Reese, no. We have to go to the broadcast tower." "You go," Reese said, turning to her. "You hack the array. You tell the galaxy the truth. I have to go to the core." "Reese." "That is suicide," Lyris hissed. "If you broadcast the truth, they will panic," Reese said. "They will detonate the bomb early to cover their tracks. Someone has to disable the detonator. Someone has to hold them off while you send the message." He looked at the reactor core below. "And someone has to pay," he added silently. Lyris looked at him, torn. She saw the resolve in his eyes. It wasn't just revenge. It was duty. Do not die. "Reese," she said fiercely, "that is an order. I will meet you at the shuttle." Reese promised. He kissed her quickly, hard, and then broke away, heading for the maintenance stairs that led down to the core. Lyris watched him go for a heartbeat, then turned and sprinted toward the elevators. The reactor core was a cathedral of humming machinery. The air vibrated with the power of a contained star. Reese moved through the shadows, silencing 2 technicians with brutal efficiency. He reached the main console. The detonator was there, a complex, chaotic encryption device wired directly into the magnetic containment field. "Well, look who decided to report for duty." The voice echoed through the chamber. Reese turned slowly. Admiral Kerrigan stood on the catwalk above him, flanked by 2 elite guards. He held a glass of wine, looking for all the world like he was at a cocktail party rather than a massacre. "Calder," Kerrigan mused, shaking his head. "You are like a cockroach. You just refuse to be stepped on." "Admiral," Reese said. His voice was level. "Call off the attack." Kerrigan laughed. It was a dry, brittle sound. "Call it off?" "Reese, my boy, do you have any idea how much this war is worth? The contracts alone will rebuild the economy." "You are going to murder thousands of people," Reese said. "Innocent people. Just like Ethelgard. Innocence is a luxury," Kerrigan snapped, his face hardening. "We are building a future, Reese, a strong, unified humanity. And yes, we have to break a few eggs. People like you. You are tools. You are hammers. You do not get to ask why the nail needs to be driven." "I am not a hammer," Reese said. He dropped his rifle. He didn't need it. He activated the combat servos in his cybernetic arm. The metal hummed, a high-pitched whine that cut through the reactor noise. "I am the wrench in your gears." "Kill him," Kerrigan ordered. The guards opened fire. Reese moved. He was a blur of motion, diving under the plasma bolts. He tackled the first guard, his cybernetic hand crushing the man's rifle and the armor beneath it. He used the guard's body as a shield, advancing on the second. It was brutal, close-quarters violence. Reese fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose but the woman he loved. He took a knife to the shoulder, grunting but not stopping. He slammed the second guard into the railing, throwing him over the edge into the coolant pool below. Kerrigan drew his sidearm, a high-powered officer's pistol. He fired. The shot caught Reese in the chest plate, knocking him backward. He hit the console, gasping for air. His armor held, but his ribs cracked. Kerrigan advanced, aiming for the head. "You should have stayed dead." "Calder," he sneered. Reese looked up. He spat blood onto the polished floor. "And you should have checked the body." Reese surged forward. He slapped the pistol aside with his flesh hand and drove his cybernetic fist into Kerrigan's stomach. The Admiral folded. Reese didn't stop. He grabbed Kerrigan by the collar and slammed him into the console. "Disarm it!" Reese roared. Kerrigan wheezed, blood bubbling on his lips. It is on a timer. You cannot stop it." Reese looked at the countdown. 3 minutes. While Reese fought for the soul of the station, Lyris fought for its voice. She burst into the broadcast control center. The technicians looked up in surprise. "Get out!" she commanded, her voice laced with psychic compulsion. They scrambled for the exit, their minds overwhelmed by the sudden urge to flee. Lyris bolted the door. She ran to the main terminal. There, waiting for her, was High Counselor Varen, the Valyri co-conspirator. He did not run. He stood calmly by the master switch. "Lyris," he said, his voice sad. "You disappoint me. You betrayed us." "Varen," Lyris spat, her fingers flying across the interface, bypassing the security lockouts. "You are working with the humans to slaughter our own kind." "I am securing our dominance," Varen shouted, losing his composure. "The Empire is weak." "Lyris, we are losing our edge. This war will harden us. It will purge the weak. Sacrifices are necessary. I am not a sacrifice." Lyris screamed. She thrust her hand forward. A blast of telekinetic force hit Varen, pinning him against the wall. She turned back to the console. She slotted the data drive. Uploading. 90%. The door behind her began to melt. Security forces were cutting through. 95%. Sparks rained down on her. A laser cutter sliced through the lock. Upload complete. Lyris hit the activation sequence. The screens around her flickered. System override. Broadcasting on all channels. The door exploded inward. Lyris spun around, raising a psychic shield as a dozen guards poured in. She was trapped. She was outgunned. "Rhys!" she screamed mentally, sending her voice across the station. "In the reactor core." Rhys heard her. It wasn't a sound, it was a feeling, a desperate, terrified tug on his soul. He looked at the bomb. He couldn't disarm the code. Kerrigan was unconscious at his feet. There was only one way. Rhys grabbed the explosive canister. He ripped it free from the coolant line. He ran toward the waste disposal chute, the airlock used to jettison radioactive debris. He jammed the canister into the tube and slammed the eject button. The outer hatch opened. The vacuum of space sucked the canister out. It detonated 3 seconds later. The explosion was massive. It didn't crack the station, but the shockwave hammered the hull. Shrapnel from the disposal tube blew back into the room. Rhys was thrown across the chamber. A jagged piece of metal the size of a spear tore through his side, shredding his armor and the flesh beneath. His cybernetic arm sparked and died. The hydraulics severed. He hit the wall and slid down, leaving a smear of bright red blood. "Rhys," Lyris's voice echoed in his head. "I am here." Rhys gasped. He tried to stand. His legs wouldn't work. He dragged himself. He crawled across the floor, trailing blood. He had to get to her. Up in the broadcast tower, Lyris held the guards back with a wall of shimmering force, but her strength was failing. "Surrender! Princess!" the guard captain yelled. Lyris looked at the master switch. Her hand hovered over it. If she pressed it, the truth would go out, the evidence of her father's treason, the proof that would destroy her family, her name, and her home. She would be the architect of the Empire's shame. She hesitated, the weight of 1,000 years of tradition pushed down on her hand. The guards stepped closer, weapons raised. Lyris looked at the screen. She saw the face of her father in the files. Then she thought of Rhys. She thought of the man dragging himself through a reactor core to save people who didn't even know his name. Her hand trembled. "Do it," she whispered to herself. But the doubt paralyzed her. Could she really destroy her own world? The guards were 3 feet away. "Princess," Lyris closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She needed him. She needed his strength. "I can't live without a male." The thought spiraled through her mind, archaic and desperate and true in a way that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the broken, beautiful human bleeding out in the dark. She opened her eyes. They were burning with white fire. The door to the broadcast chamber did not open. It disintegrated. A breaching charge turned the heavy durasteel into a spray of molten slag and shrapnel, filling the room with biting smoke and the smell of ozone. Lyra stood with her back to the main console, her hand hovering over the activation switch. She was trapped. The dozen Imperial guards who stormed through the breach were not there to arrest her. They were there to erase her. "Target acquired," the guard captain barked, his voice amplified by his helmet. "Eliminate the traitor." Lyris raised a hand, summoning the last dregs of her psychic strength to form a barrier. But she was exhausted. The station's reactor hummed beneath her feet, a vibration she could feel in her teeth, reminding her of the bomb that had just detonated and the man who had gone down there to stop it. "Fire!" the captain ordered. Time seemed to warp, stretching into a slow, agonizing crawl. Lyris saw the muzzles of the plasma rifles flare blue. She saw death coming for her. She closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in a final silent prayer for Rhys. Then, a shadow moved in the smoke. It was not a graceful entrance. It was a collision. A body, battered and bleeding, hurled itself from the side maintenance hatch, putting itself directly in the line of fire. "Rhys!" Lyris screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. Rhys Calder did not have his armor. He did not have his shield generator. He had only his flesh, his failing cybernetics, and a stubborn refusal to let her die alone. The plasma bolts hit him. One struck his cybernetic shoulder, shattering the carbon fiber and fusing the servos. Another took him in the thigh. A third grazed his ribs and spinning him around. He did not scream. He grunted, a wet, heavy sound of impact, and collapsed at her feet. The firing stopped. Even the guards were stunned by the sudden brutality of the sacrifice. Rhys hit the floor hard, blood pooling instantly beneath him, bright red human blood, stark against the sterile white tiles of the command center. He wheezed, his hand reaching out to grip the hem of her cloak, leaving a crimson smear on the fabric. Lyris fell to her knees beside him. Her hands hovered over his wounds, shaking so violently she could barely breathe. "You idiot," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "You absolute primitive idiot." Rhys looked up at her. His face was gray, sweat cutting tracks through the soot and blood. One of his eyes was swollen shut. He tried to grin, but it came out as a grimace of pain. "Had to." "Be the distraction," he rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. The guard captain stepped forward, raising his weapon again. His hesitation was gone. "Step away from the human." "Princess," the captain commanded, "your execution is next." Lyris looked at the weapon. Then she looked at Rhys. She looked at the blood on her hands, his blood. Something inside her broke. And in the breaking, it released a fury that was hotter than any star. She did not step away. She stood up. She turned her back on the guns and slammed her bloody hand down onto the master activation switch. The screens lining the walls of the chamber flared to life. The room was bathed in the blue light of the broadcast. But it was not just this room. Across the station, on every holovid screen in the diplomatic quarter, the image appeared. On the bridges of the Valyri warships and human cruisers holding a standoff in orbit. The feed overrode the tactical displays. On the surface of Okaris, in the dusty bars of Havelock Station, and in the gilded halls of the Imperial Palace light years away, the galaxy stopped. They saw her. Princess Lyris Valyrian stood tall, her white hair wild and matted with sweat, her ceremonial robes torn. She was not the polished, untouchable idol on the propaganda posters. She was real. She was terrified. And her hands were covered in blood. "Look at this!" she screamed, thrusting her red-stained hands toward the camera pickup. Her voice was not the melodic, rehearsed tone of a diplomat. It was raw, guttural, and trembling with rage. Look at what your leaders have purchased with their lies. Behind her, the guards froze. They knew they were alive. They knew the eyes of billions were watching. "My name is Lyris Valerian," she announced, her voice stabilizing into a cold, diamond-hard force. "And I accuse the High Council of treason. I accuse Helios Dominion of murder." She keyed the console, and the data from the vault began to stream alongside her video feed. Documents, audio logs, bank transfers, the damning evidence of the false flag attack, the bioweapon manifests, the communications between her father and the human defense minister. "They told you we were enemies," Lyris said, tears streaming down her face, cutting through the grime. "They told you the other side wanted to destroy you. They lied. They sold your fear for profit. They tried to bomb this station today to force you into a war that would make them rich and leave you dead." She stepped back, the camera tracking her as she knelt beside Reese again. She touched his face, her fingers gentle on his battered skin. "This man," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that echoed across the stars. "This man is a human veteran, a soldier you were told was a monster. He just gave his life to save a Valeri princess. He crawled through a radioactive core to disarm the bomb meant to kill us all." She looked up into the lens, her star-flecked eyes blazing with a fierce, undeniable conviction. "They say our species cannot coexist. They say love cannot cross the void between us." She took Reese's limp hand and pressed it against her chest, right over her heart. "I love him," she confessed, the words ringing out like a bell. "I love this human, and if we can find this, if we can find loyalty and sacrifice in the middle of your manufactured hate, then there is no excuse for this war." She stared directly into the camera, addressing the soldiers on both sides. "Put down your weapons. Do not fire for the traitors who sold you. Choose. Right now. Choose who you are." The silence that followed the transmission was absolute. In the chamber, the guard captain's finger tightened on the trigger. He was a loyalist, bred for obedience. "Cut the feed," he roared. "Kill her." He raised his rifle. "No!" The shout did not come from Reese. It came from the young lieutenant standing behind the captain. The lieutenant tackled his superior officer. A blast of plasma went wild, scorching the ceiling. The room erupted into chaos. The security detail split down the middle, half of them, moved by the broadcast and the evidence of their own leader's betrayal, turned on the loyalists. "Protect the princess!" the lieutenant screamed, firing a stun round into a loyalist guard. Lyris did not watch the firefight. She collapsed over Reese, shielding him with her body as energy bolts sizzled through the air above them. "Reese," she choked out. "Stay with me, please." She ripped open a pouch on her belt, pulling out a Valeri biostimulant. It was risky for human physiology, but she had no choice. She jammed the injector into his neck. Then she grabbed a canister of human med foam from his belt and sprayed it frantically over his chest and shoulder. Reese gasped, his body arching as the stimulant hit his heart. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and hazy. "The Lyris," he mumbled. "I am here," she sobbed, pressing her hands against his chest to hold the pressure. "I am right here." The room went quiet. The loyalists were subdued. The lieutenant stood over them, breathing hard, his weapon lowered. "The medical team is inbound." "Your Highness," the lieutenant said, his voice filled with awe. Lyris didn't look at him. She only saw Reese. His breathing was shallow, a wet rattle in his lungs. He was fading. The light behind his eyes was dimming. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely, grabbing his face with both hands. "Don't you dare leave me alone here." Reese called her. Reese tried to speak, but only a cough of blood came out. I can't. Lyris's voice broke, fracturing into a wail of pure, unadulterated grief. She leaned her forehead against his, their blood mingling. I can't live without a male, she cried, the words tearing out of her, stripping away all her royal conditioning, all her pride, all her independence. I can't live without you. It was the admission she had been terrified to make, the vulnerability she had run from across a solar system. She was a creature of the stars, powerful and proud, but in this moment, she was just a woman holding the only thing that mattered to her. Reese blinked. The stimulant was kicking in, firing his synapses. He heard her. He heard the title of the story she was writing about her life. He forced his lips to move. A ghost of his old, dry smirk touched his mouth. That, he whispered, his voice barely audible, is terrible confession timing. Princess. Lyris let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. She pulled back slightly to look at him. You are impossible, she wept. I am serious. Reese wheezed, his hand twitching in hers. I am bleeding out. On the floor. And you get sentimental. Shut up. She kissed his forehead, rocking him gently. Just shut up and live. Reese looked at her. His vision was tunneling, black edges creeping in, but her face was the anchor. I am done running. Lyris, he whispered, the promise heavy and final. From the war. From you. If I make it, I stay. You stay. She agreed, clutching him tighter. You stay forever. Then the darkness took him. But this time, he wasn't afraid of it. He knew she was there, guarding the light. The galaxy did not change in a day, but it turned. The broadcast had been a hammer blow to the glass house of the conspiracy. The footage of the defense minister conspiring with the Valyri High Council sparked riots on Earth and Valyria Prime. It wasn't a war that broke out. It was a revolution. Admiral Kerrigan was arrested in the station's medbay. The defense minister resigned in disgrace before being taken into custody. On the Valyri side, Lyris's father tried to flee to the Outer Rim, but his own honor guard turned him in. The war machine halted. The fleets in orbit stood down, their captains refusing to fire on a peace station that had almost been a tomb. Emergency councils were formed. Tribunals were established. The word reform was on every news feed, spoken with the desperation of politicians trying to save their own skins from an angry populace. And in the center of the storm was the frontier moon of Okaris. Reese spent 3 weeks in the intensive care unit of the colony's main hospital. His body, already a patchwork of scars and metal, took time to knit back together. The doctors had to replace his cybernetic arm entirely, and the shrapnel in his side left a new, jagged line of silver skin grafts. He was not alone. Lyris came every day. She had been stripped of her title as Keeper of the Silver Spire by the traditionalists in the council. But the title didn't matter anymore. The people called her something else. They called her the Envoy. She sat by his bed, reading him news reports, critiquing the hospital food with her usual imperial disdain, and holding his hand with a possessiveness that made the nurses smile and whisper. Their intimacy, once a secret stolen in caves and dark tunnels, was now open. When she adjusted his pillows, her hands lingered. When he woke up from a nightmare of the reactor, she was there to smooth the hair back from his forehead. They were curious, the human veteran and the alien princess. Strangers would stop them in the hallways when Reese finally started walking again, shaking his hand, bowing to her. It was awkward. Reese hated the attention. Lyris handled it with grace, but she always steered them back to the privacy of his room as quickly as possible. 6 weeks after the broadcast, the decision came down. The new Joint Government Council had debated for days. They couldn't let Lyris return to the capital. She was too polarizing, a living reminder of the old regime's failure. But they couldn't exile her either. She was a hero to billions. So they compromised. Rhys sat on the edge of his hospital bed, buttoning a fresh shirt. His new arm, matte black, sleeker than the old Helios model, whirred softly. Lyris stood by the window, looking out at the dusty street of the colony. She held a data pad. "It is official," she said, turning to him. "They are calling it an unofficial liaison position. I am to remain in the border territories. I will act as an intermediary for the resettlement projects." Rhys looked at her. He stopped buttoning his shirt. "Where?" he asked. Lyris smiled. It was a small, shy smile that belonged only to him. "Here," she said, "on Okaris. They think it is a punishment, a backwater assignment to keep me out of the way." "And what do you think?" Rhys asked, standing up. He walked over to her, his limp barely noticeable. Lyris dropped the data pad on the sill. She stepped into his space, wrapping her arms around his waist. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. "I think," she whispered, "that I am finally done with palaces." The homestead had not changed, but the feeling of it had. The red dust still blew across the cobalt sky. The wind still howled through the canyons. But the silence was gone. Rhys parked the mule, miraculously repaired by Jax, who had sent a bill for heroic mechanical services, in the shed. He walked toward the cabin. The blast shutters were open, warm. Yellow light spilled out onto the iron sand. Lyris stood in the doorway. She was wearing simple clothes, trousers and a tunic made of local fabric, but she still looked luminous. A small travel case sat at her feet. It was the final threshold. Rhys stopped at the bottom of the steps. He looked at her. He looked at the woman who had saved his life, the woman who had ended a war, the woman who had looked into a camera and told the universe she loved him. "You know," Rhys said, leaning against the railing, his voice gruff but warm. "The plumbing is still primitive, the coffee is still sludge, and the storms get loud at night." Lyris picked up her case. She walked down the steps until she was standing on the same level as him. "I have grown fond of the sludge," she said, "and I find the storms cozy." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "For my whole life, Rhys, I was told where to live. I was told who to be. Today, for the first time, I am choosing." She reached out and took his hand. "I am choosing this place. I am choosing you." Rhys looked at their joined hands, carbon fiber and luminous skin, metal and flesh. He squeezed her hand. He walked past her, up the steps, to the security panel by the door. He keyed in a command sequence he had programmed weeks ago. "System alert," the automated voice chimed. "New resident registered." Rhys turned back to her. "It is a permanent registration," he said. "No guest pass, no expiration date." Lyris felt a lump form in her throat. She walked up the steps to stand beside him. "How long is permanent?" she asked softly. Rhys put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her into him. He kissed the top of her head. "As long as forever lasts, Your Highness." They walked inside, and the door sealed shut against the wind, not to keep the world out, but to keep their home safe. The night on Okaris was clear. The storm season had passed, leaving the sky a vast, unobstructed dome of velvet black, dusted with the diamond dust of the Milky Way. Rhys and Lyris sat on the flat roof of the homestead. They had dragged a thermal blanket up there, and they sat shoulder to shoulder, leaning against the chimney stack. Reese held a bottle of real beer, a gift from Jax, and Lyris held a cup of tea that actually smelled like tea. Below them, in the patch of soil Reese had tilled that morning, small marker stakes stuck out of the red ground. "I still think tubers are a mistake," Lyris argued, though there was no heat in her voice, only a lazy contentment. "The soil acidity is too high. We should plant star vines. They are bioluminescent. They would look beautiful from orbit. We are farming for food, Lyris, not for decoration." Reese chuckled, taking a sip of his beer. "You cannot eat a glow-in-the-dark vine." "You have no soul," she teased, nudging him with her shoulder. "I have you," he countered. "That is enough soul for both of us." Lyris went quiet. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Reese shifted his arm to wrap it around her, pulling her closer into the warmth of his side. She looked up at the sky. She could see the faint moving lights of ships in the high orbital lanes, cruisers and freighters, moving freely across the border. No blockades, no burning wreckage. "Do you miss it?" she asked quietly. "The fight?" Reese followed her gaze. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held rifles for 20 years, the hands that were now calloused from a shovel and a hoe. He thought about the adrenaline, the clarity of combat, the brotherhood of the squad. Then he felt Lyris against him. He felt the peace of the desert. He felt the future stretching out, unwritten and wide. "No," Reese said. "I fought so I could stop fighting. I ran so I could find a place to stop." He looked down at her. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Lyris smiled. She reached up and kissed his jaw. "So am I. My primitive soldier. So am I." They sat there for a long time, two former weapons of empires, scarred and strange and perfectly matched. They watched the stars wheel overhead, indifferent to their presence, while below them, in the dusty, stubborn soil of a frontier moon, the seeds of a shared life waited for the morning sun to begin the hard, beautiful work of growing.